As of July 27, 2026, 86 active wildfires are burning simultaneously across the state of Oregon. Together, they have already consumed more than 1 million acres of land. More than 33,000 Oregonians are under evacuation orders right now as you hear this. The Oregon Department of Forestry estimated that by July 24th, roughly 577,000 acres had burned in Oregon alone, a total that already surpasses the entire acreage consumed during Oregon's 2022 fire season, and the most destructive months of the summer still lie ahead. Fire season in the Pacific Northwest doesn't typically reach its peak until August and September. What is happening in the Pacific Northwest today is not a routine bad year. It is, by every metric that matters, a dangerous and accelerating emergency. Do you understand why that word, emergency, is the only accurate word for what is unfolding? You have to begin with the event that ignited all of this, and then trace it through a layered system of ecological, climatic, financial, and political crises that have come together to make this summer so much worse than almost anyone was prepared for. On the evening of July 15th, 2026, a series of dry thunderstorms rolled across the Cascade Range. These were not ordinary thunderstorms. They produced thousands of lightning strikes as they swept eastward across Oregon and Washington, but they carried almost no rainfall. Dry thunderstorms are among the most dangerous weather events for fire conditions because the lightning delivers a massive ignition source without the suppressive moisture that would normally follow. The lightning had nowhere to go except into landscapes that had been drying out for months. NASA's own Earth data satellite systems, tracking the Pacific Northwest from orbit, began detecting large numbers of wildland fires burning throughout central and eastern Oregon by the very next morning, July 16th. Initially small, these blazes found exactly what they needed to grow. Landscapes parched by extreme drought, summer heat that had baked the vegetation into tinder, and gusty winds to push the flames across terrain with little standing in their way. The conditions could not have been more favorable for catastrophic fire spread, and that is precisely what happened. By July 18th, just 3 days after the initial lightning event, the situation had escalated so severely that the National Interagency Fire Center raised the national preparedness level to 5. That is the highest designation on a 5-tier scale, reserved for moments when fire demand across the United States reaches the outermost limits of national firefighting capacity. The last time such a declaration was issued was during some of the most destructive fire years in recent American history. The Pacific Northwest was at the center of that July 2026 declaration. The single largest fire born from that mid-July lightning event is the Rowe Creek Complex, burning across Wheeler, Wasco, and Crook counties in central Oregon near the small community of Fossil. The Rowe Creek Complex was ignited by lightning strikes on July 15th and 16th near the Twickenham area of Wheeler County. It burns through a mix of grass, juniper, and timber across remote, rugged terrain that makes every containment effort exponentially harder than it would be on flatter ground. As of July 28th, 2026, the fire had grown to 294,900 acres. It held just 33% containment with nearly 1,400 personnel assigned to fight it. 47 crews, 24 bulldozers, 74 engines. Multiple fires within the complex have merged into one another. The Crosswhite, Brewer, and Green Mountain fires have folded together into a single larger fire footprint that continues to erase every containment boundary firefighters attempt to establish. At its peak, the Rowe Creek Complex was not just the largest active fire in Oregon, it was the largest active wildfire burning anywhere in the United States. Highway 26 between Prineville and Mitchell was closed. Communities across Wheeler, Wasco, and Crook counties faced evacuation notices ranging from preparedness warnings to immediate departure orders, and fire officials were preparing for the Rowe Creek Complex to merge with the nearby Brewer Fire, which would have further expanded an already massive footprint. But the Rowe Creek Complex is not the only fire demanding attention. It is not even the only fire of this scale. A fast-moving grass fire that ignited on July 23rd along the Oregon-Idaho border near Jordan Valley exploded to approximately 280,000 acres within days of its ignition. It sat at just 5% containment when those numbers were reported, a figure that tells you almost everything about how far ahead of suppression capacity these fires are running. In the North Cascades, lightning-caused fires continue to challenge crews in some of the most rugged terrain in the country. Washington State is managing 5 large active fires. The Grasshopper Fire in Mount Hood National Forest has grown beyond 4,500 acres. The Akawa Butte Fire, burning in Deschutes and Jefferson counties, has exceeded 27,000 acres and sits at just 6% containment. The Bench Fire near Warm Springs in Jefferson County has forced Level 3 Go Now evacuation orders, the most urgent evacuation category in Oregon's 3-tier system, and the combined Bench and Beachcomb fires have grown to well over 40,000 acres. Oregon's Emergency Conflagration Act, the declaration that authorizes the state fire marshal to mobilize emergency firefighting resources beyond normal operational capacity, has been invoked 10 times this fire season, 10 separate invocations. Each one represents a fire that crossed the threshold of what routine response could manage. These fires are burning in a landscape that has been systematically dried out by drought over the course of months and years. According to U.S. Drought Monitor data, some category of drought covers 88% of Oregon, 81% of Idaho, and 64% of Washington. Those are not fringe or localized conditions. Those are near total coverage figures that mean the vast majority of the Pacific Northwest entered this fire season with critically low soil moisture, reduced snowpack from the preceding winter, stressed and desiccated vegetation, and surface fuels prepared to combust under any ignition source. The U.S. Forest Service Chief Tom Schultz put it plainly during a congressional subcommittee hearing in late July 2026. "We are experiencing higher than average national fire activity after a dry winter," Schultz said. Extensive drought and excessive heat are worsening hazardous fuel conditions across large parts of the West. He was not speaking in abstractions. He was describing the terrain where over 10,000 firefighters are working right now. What makes this summer's emergency particularly significant is not just the raw scale of what is burning, but the velocity at which it has developed. To appreciate that velocity, consider the comparison that the Northwest Interagency Coordination Center's own data makes possible. Through July 21st, 2025, Oregon had 7 active large fires that had burned a combined total of 102,791 acres. Through July 24th, 2026, the same point in the calendar, Oregon had 42 large active fires burning 406,846 acres. That is nearly 4 times the burned acreage at the same calendar date from almost 6 times as many fires. The estimated suppression costs through July 21st, 2025 were approximately $61.8 million. By July 21st, 2026, those costs had already climbed by more than $34 million above that level, and the season still has 2 of its historically most destructive months ahead. Jessica Nuyar, a public affairs officer for the Oregon Department of Forestry, captured the fragility of the current situation with a single sentence. She said that conditions are so dry that any small ember right now could potentially start the next large wildfire. That is not a rhetorical warning. That is an operational assessment made by someone watching dozens of fires simultaneously. The Oregon Department of Forestry has been tracking fire acreage data going back to 1996, and the long-term trend that data reveals is one that fire scientists have been describing for years. The average annual acreage burned in Oregon over the decade from 1996 to 2005 was 287,941 acres. Over the following decade, from 2006 to 2015, that average climbed to 509,738 acres, a jump of nearly 77% in a single decade. Over the most recent decade, from 2016 to 2025, the annual average reached 680,994 acres. That is a near tripling of the decadal average over 30 years, and those are averages that include the relatively moderate fire years that pull the number down. The individual peak years tell an even more alarming story. In 2024, one of the most active fire seasons in recent Oregon history, a season that rivaled the catastrophic 2020 fire year, previously treated as an outlier, 1,797,797 acres burned in Oregon alone. With 2026 already burning at a pace that outstrips 2025 by nearly 4 times at the same point in the calendar, the question of whether this year will approach or challenge those peak year numbers is one that fire managers and state officials are actively and urgently discussing. The Oregon Department of Forestry's July estimate of 577,000 acres already exceeded the pre-2016 decade average, and the season's most active period had not yet arrived. The scale of resources mobilized to fight these fires reflects how seriously emergency managers are treating this moment. By mid-July, the Oregon State Fire Marshal had deployed over 700 firefighters. Alongside them, nearly 250 engines and water tenders deployed to 6 conflagrations and several other response assignments simultaneously. The Oregon Department of Forestry has drawn firefighting resources from 8 other states: Minnesota, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, California, Alabama, Tennessee, and Nevada. The fact that Oregon is importing firefighting capacity from states as geographically and climatically distant as Louisiana and Georgia tells you something essential about where the situation sits in the hierarchy of American emergency response. More than 10,300 personnel were assigned to large fires across Oregon in late July alone. The Rowe Creek Complex has nearly 1,400 of those personnel working its lines on any given day, clearing branches and steep terrain, cutting fire lines through juniper and timber, working outward from Highway 26 to build defensive barriers before the flames arrive. These are the numbers of a genuine national emergency response, not a regional fire management operation. The human cost of these fires extends far beyond the immediate danger of flame. Communities across central and eastern Oregon have been forced from their homes, in some cases with no certainty about when they can return. Among the most striking examples of what this emergency looks like on the ground is what happened on the Warm Springs Reservation in Jefferson County. The bench fire, pushed by extreme behavior, including wind-driven runs and long-range spotting that created 3 separate fronts simultaneously, threatened the Warm Springs community directly. Level 3. Go now. Evacuation orders were issued for all of Warm Springs. Highway 26, between the reservation and Madras, the nearest city, was closed due to heavy smoke and fire crossing the highway itself. Evacuees shared videos on social media showing flames bordering the highway as they fled. The fire destroyed at least 6 homes and 5 agricultural buildings in the Bench and Beachcomb Fire area. The Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, whose connection to this landscape predates the state of Oregon by centuries, found themselves displaced from their land by a fire that exhibited what officials described as extreme, rapidly changing behavior. Jefferson County officials warned the public that evacuation levels were changing by the minute. We are trying to keep you as updated as possible and making sure all the notifications go out to the impacted people in the community, the sheriff's office said. And as we typed this out, levels changed, then changed again. That is the speed at which these fires are moving. For ranching and agricultural communities across the region, the fires carry a different but equally devastating economic weight. The vast sagebrush country and rangeland burning across central and eastern Oregon may not produce the same dramatic visual imagery as a burning forest, but to the ranchers and cattle producers whose entire economic model depends on that grass, every burned acre is a direct financial loss. Diana Worth, a Klamath County rancher and the president of the Oregon Cattlemen's Association, described the situation in late July 2026 with clarity. Some of her organization's members had already lost their feed stores to the fires. Some had lost access to water because the power outages that forced human evacuations also knocked out the electric pumps that move water to their animals. The fires consumed private rangelands and public grazing allotments alike, eliminating forage that ranchers depend on to sustain their herds through summer and fall. The intensity of the fires in some areas made evacuating livestock more difficult than it would have been in slower-moving fire years. These communities are not peripheral to the wildfire story in the Pacific Northwest. They are among its most seriously affected populations, and their losses are economic in a way that is immediate, tangible, and in many cases extremely difficult to recover from. The air quality consequences of fires at this scale are spreading well beyond the fire perimeters. Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality issued air quality health advisories in effect for Baker, Crook, Gilliam, Grant, Harney, Jefferson, Malheur, Morrow, Umatilla, Union, Wallowa, Wasco, and Wheeler counties. Intermittent smoke and degraded air quality were also possible in Deschutes, eastern Douglas, Hood River, northern Jackson, northern Klamath, Lake, and Sherman counties. When NASA's Aqua satellite captured imagery of the region on July 26th, smoke poured northeast from dozens of large fires, producing a blanket of haze across hundreds of square miles of the Pacific Northwest. Wildfire smoke from the northwest swept across the United States, reaching the mid-Atlantic and southeastern states. Most of that smoke was forecast to remain high in the atmosphere as it traveled east, preventing the worst surface-level impacts beyond the immediate region. But in the Pacific Northwest, the smoke is not abstract or distant. It hangs over cities and rural communities alike, and it poses real and documented health risks, particularly for people with existing respiratory conditions, for the elderly, for children, and for anyone who spends significant time outdoors. Smoke levels change quickly in an active fire environment, and the advisories affecting more than a dozen Oregon counties reflect a sustained degradation of air quality that has been ongoing for weeks. Into this already severe crisis has arrived a political dimension that has made a difficult situation significantly more complicated and more expensive for the state of Oregon. When fires of this scale burn, states typically apply to the Federal Emergency Management Agency for what are called Fire Management Assistance Grants, known as FMAGs. These grants provide a 75% federal cost share on wildfire suppression expenditures, with the state covering the remaining 25%. They exist specifically for situations like the one Oregon is currently facing, rapidly growing fires that threaten communities and infrastructure, where the costs of suppression escalate faster than any state can absorb independently. Governor Tina Kotek applied for FMAGs for 5 Oregon fires. FEMA approved 3 of those applications, for the Lower Dry Creek Fire, the Akawa Butte Fire, and the Grasshopper Fire. FEMA denied the other 2, the East Evans Creek Fire and the Rowe Creek Fire Complex. The denial of the Rowe Creek Complex application is particularly striking in light of the conditions under which it was refused. When Oregon submitted its application for federal assistance on that complex, more than 401 people were under Level 3 Go Now evacuation orders. The fire was actively threatening electrical cooperatives, public safety radio infrastructure, and regional power transmission lines. At the time of the denial, The Rowe Creek Fire Complex was the largest active wildfire burning anywhere in the United States. FEMA turned down the application. The agency also denied the East Evans Creek Fire application, which was submitted on July the 22nd, when the state reported the fire had reached nearly 16,000 acres and more than 230 homes were under Level 3 evacuation orders. The East Evans Creek Fire was simultaneously threatening county, state, and federal roads and bridges, radio and cell towers, gas and private electric utilities, campgrounds, trails, retail businesses, irrigation infrastructure, and agricultural operations across Jackson County in southern Oregon. FEMA denied that application as well. Oregon's U.S. Senators Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley responded with a joint letter to FEMA's acting administrator and described the denials as a significant departure from FEMA's historical criteria and agency guidance. The senators explained that for years, state officials had understood the threshold for an FMAG to include fires that put at least 150 primary residences in immediate threat, a threshold that has in recent practice risen to more than 200 residences, and that both denied fires had exceeded that standard when their applications were made. What the senators identified as particularly alarming was a shift in how FEMA was interpreting its own criteria. The agency's policy manual states that an FMAG is warranted when a fire threatens such destruction as would constitute a major disaster. The Trump administration's FEMA appeared to be applying a higher and different standard, apparently requiring that fires also independently qualify for a major disaster declaration, which is a separate federal designation with its own distinct criteria, not historically linked to the FMAG qualification. This shift in interpretation, the senators argued, is contrary to federal regulation and to FEMA's own published guidance. Oregon has 30 days to appeal the denials, and Governor Kotek's office has indicated it is already considering next steps. Putting everything we have into first response is absolutely mission critical right now, Kotek said. Securing these additional federal resources will ensure continued support for the courageous and tireless work of our firefighters on the ground. The financial stakes of these denials are concrete. The Rowe Creek Complex had accumulated an estimated $14.5 million in suppression costs by late July 2026. The total estimated cost of the East Evans Creek fire response had reached approximately $60 million. When federal cost sharing is denied on fires of this scale, those expenditures fall directly on the state budget and ultimately on Oregon taxpayers, at a moment when the state is already managing an extraordinary volume of simultaneous fire emergencies. Across the full 2026 fire season in Oregon, suppression costs are running tens of millions of dollars above the comparable point in 2025. Every dollar that should be shared 75% by the federal government and is instead borne entirely by the state is a dollar that places additional pressure on an already strained fire response budget. This political and financial conflict matters beyond the immediate accounting because it sits within a much larger and more consequential question about how the United States is going to manage wildfire in the Pacific Northwest and the broader West going forward. The data on Oregon fire acreage over 30 years, from a decadal average of 288,000 acres in the late 1990s and early 2000s, to a decadal average of nearly 681,000 acres in the most recent 10 years, describes a system under sustained and accelerating stress. The fires of 2026 are not a departure from trend. They are an expression of it. The national picture confirms this. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, by mid-May 2026, the United States had already seen 25,560 fires, burning 1.88 million acres nationwide, nearly double the 10-year average of 1.05 million acres for the same period. As of late July 2026, the national total stood at 29,023 fires that have collectively burned 2,349,000 acres. The traditional peak of fire season had not yet arrived. The reasons the Pacific Northwest finds itself at this point are neither mysterious nor new. They are the accumulated consequence of changing climate conditions that have been shifting the baseline of fire risk in measurable and documented ways for decades. Rising temperatures accelerate snowmelt, pushing the fire season earlier. Reduced winter precipitation leaves soils drier going into summer. Longer and more intense summer heat events desiccate vegetation beyond the thresholds that historically characterize the region. The feedback loops are real. Less snowpack means less cold water runoff in spring, which means drier soils earlier in the season, which means vegetation with significantly less moisture content when late summer heat and wind arrive. The dry thunderstorms of July 15th were the match. The years of drought and warming that preceded them were the fuel load that made the match so catastrophic. What the fires of summer 2026 are demonstrating, with painful specificity, is that the Pacific Northwest has entered a period in which the old assumptions about fire season, its length, its intensity, its geographic reach, its financial costs, no longer hold. The assumption that fire season is primarily a late August and September phenomenon is tested every year by fires that grow explosively in July. The assumption that any individual fire season is an outlier is tested by data showing that the region's 10-year average of burned acreage has more than doubled over 3 decades. The assumption that federal emergency management systems will scale to meet the demand is tested every time a grant application is denied for the largest active wildfire in the country. For the firefighters working the Rowe Creek Complex, the Jordan Valley Fire, the Bench and Beachcomb Fires, the Grasshopper Fire, the Akawa Butte Fire, and the dozens of other active incidents across Oregon and Washington right now, the policy debates and financial disputes happening in Washington, D.C. are far removed from the immediate reality of their work. Those 47 crews on the Rowe Creek Complex are working in remote Wheeler County terrain, clearing snags, cutting fire line through juniper, patrolling the fire's edge in smoke and heat, making decisions about where a bulldozer can safely build a containment line, and where the terrain and fire behavior make that impossible. The interstate resources, from Minnesota, from Louisiana, from Georgia, from Florida, from Alabama, from Tennessee, from Nevada, from California, are here because Oregon's own resources reached their limits weeks ago. The National Preparedness Level 5 declaration means every available resource in the national firefighting system is being directed toward active fires. That is not a situation that has much room left in it before it reaches the edges of what the system can provide. And still, the Rowe Creek Complex sits at 33% containment. The Jordan Valley Fire sits at 5%. The Bench Fire continues to threaten communities and infrastructure in Jefferson County. The Emergency Conflagration Act has been invoked 10 times. 33,000 people are still not home. The air quality in 13 Oregon counties is degraded. The ranchers of central and eastern Oregon are calculating what they have lost and whether they can recover. The Warm Springs Reservation community is living through the displacement of land whose significance cannot be measured in any economic terms. The suppression costs are climbing daily, and August has not yet arrived. The Pacific Northwest is a region of ecological richness and cultural depth. Its forests, its rangelands, its rivers, and its communities represent a way of life that millions of people depend on, and that has shaped this corner of the continent for longer than any living person can remember. The fires burning across it right now are a threat to all of that simultaneously. To the land itself, to the air above it, to the homes and livelihoods and heritage that give this region its character. The scale of that threat is not invisible or distant. It is measured in the 86 active fires confirmed burning as of July 27th. It is measured in the 1 million acres already consumed. It is measured in the 33,000 people under evacuation orders. It is measured in the 10 invocations of a state emergency act. It is measured in the federal assistance denied for the largest fire in the country. It is measured in the smoke that NASA satellites captured blanketing the Pacific Northwest from orbit. And it is measured in the simple fact that when a public affairs officer for the Oregon Department of Forestry describes current conditions, she says that any small ember right now could potentially start the next large wildfire, and that statement is not an exaggeration. The Pacific Northwest is not facing a difficult fire week. It is not even facing a difficult fire season in any ordinary sense of that phrase. It is facing the convergence of decades of accumulated conditions: drought, warming, fuel load, expanded fire season, arriving in a year when those conditions have aligned with exceptional and destructive force. Peak season has not yet arrived. This is not the worst it may get. The data, the scale of the emergency response, the financial pressures on the state, and the communities displaced from their homes and their land are all pointing in the same direction. What is happening in the Pacific Northwest right now is a genuine emergency, and by every honest measure available, it is one that is not finished yet.